Hey everyone, welcome to Unit 16, laying concrete block to the line. So by the end of this presentation, these are a few things you should be able to do. Now, if you were in lab, you will be able to make bed joints and head joints for concrete block, lay concrete block to the line, cut concrete block with a brick set and a hammer, describe protection of block walls from weather, and the insulated concrete block masonry we really don't need to be concerned with. So laying concrete block to the line is very similar to laying brick to the line. It's just much bigger. For efficiency and for speed, make sure that the materials that you're working with are all within reach. Concrete blocks, you might think that they're tough, but they easily chip and crack. It's real easy if you drop one to break it. And make sure that you keep it dry at all times. If the concrete block isn't dry and it's wet, as we talked about in the previous unit, it'll affect the strength of the mortar by the amount of water that's in it. So when it's time to spread mortar, you can see this is slightly different than laying a brick because your mortar is on the outsides. Pay attention to the trowel position, and you can see what side of the trowel that they're using. Here's the line that they're laying to. And obviously right here is where your next block is going to be going. So if there are any holes in your block, which happens sometimes, make sure you fill them with mortar. Just as we talked about in the previous unit, if they are removed after initial set, it could cause your walls to leak. Never, ever, ever dust your joints with dry cement. This changes the mix, as we talked about in a previous unit, and it'll end up being more cement and it'll set too quickly. So when you're laying your first course, always make sure that the wall with the wider web of the block is facing up. And when you guys are in lab, you'll see this when you're able to pick up the block, and when you start laying it to the line. As with brick, level and plumb wall depends on the first course. So your first course will help you set the tone for the way the rest of your wall looks. Just as with brick, with your block, you'll build your leads first. And your first course will be run from here to here. Now, what you'll see sometimes when you're laying that is that your footer or floor that you're laying on may not be perfect. So when you have your line run, be sure to run your block to your line. Sometimes you have to add a little bit more mortar on the bottom, and sometimes you need to trim the bottom of your block in order to make it fit. So just be aware that it won't be a perfect fit all the time. So when you're applying your head joint, which is right here, again, note the trowel position and what side of the trowel they're using. Make sure that you get it on both ears of the block. So it's difficult to see in this picture, but if you had a top view of a cinder block, it looks something like this. And right here are your ears. Make sure your head joints are placed on your ears. And always lift with the webs to place it on. Don't try to pick it up by the middle with one hand. Sometimes blocks can weigh upwards of 50 pounds, and it's difficult and it's not safe. Always place the block in your mortar. You can always tap it down, but if you drop it in and your bed joint pops out too much, you have to take it out and reset. Don't spread your mortar too far ahead. You don't want it to set. As soon as that mortar comes in contact with this dry cinder block, it's going to want to suck the moisture out of your mortar. It helps it set, but it also makes it more difficult to lay if you're too far ahead. If you have an uneven block, which happens quite a bit, remove it and lay it in fresh mortar. And that's kind of what I touched on in the last slide. If you have enough mortar in place, you can just tap it with your hammer. These blocks are the most difficult and the trickiest. So if you're running a wall and you have your corners set, one lead here, the other lead here, you're always going to run into this issue with this one that you need to close. So when you do that, make sure you apply mortar to all joints on all four edges. So that's your ears here, ears here, ears here, here, and your bottom one. On these, you need to be careful. The technique that they're demonstrating here is pretty good. Slowly lower it into place and using your trowel. You can have it tip back and then slide your trowel out through the front. As we talked about in previous units, so sometimes walls require additional strength, and you can lay wire reinforcement in your joints. So remember, we have the Z ones, the rectangle, the truss style, and the ladder style. So again, as with other stuff, make sure that those are job specifications. Double check with the general superintendent, double check with the engineer, double check with an architect to see what wire reinforcements go in. When you're ready to tool the joint, make sure that your joiner, striker, slicker, whatever you're using, that's slightly larger than the mortar joint. So for us, these joints that we'd be using would be about 5/8 of an inch. In this picture, you can see that they're using a sled runner. Those are about 16 inches long, which is roughly the length of a block. You're able to cover a lot more area with a sled one than you are with the slickers that we have. But we don't do big walls. You guys will only be laying a few. So some ways that you can cut with concrete block. You can use your hammer. So your masonry hammer, you can see he's using the chisel end of it right here. And you just make sure that you tap, 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 and you'll hear the sound difference in the block once it starts to fracture. You can use a blocking chisel. And we do have a masonry saw here that we use with water. You need water because of the amount of dust that it produces. Do not cut concrete block on a hard surface such as a concrete slab or a wall. It won't fracture too nice for you, and it'll end up throwing pieces all over the place. So some safety practices, like I said, with lifting of concrete blocks, sometimes you're tempted to grab it by the web in the center. Don't. Always grab it by the webs on the end. If you fall or slip with concrete block, again, some of these weigh around 50 pounds a piece, so be aware of that when you're carrying it. Always plan your trip. Make sure that there's no hazards in front of you where you could fall or slip. When you are cutting, like I said before, If you're cutting with a saw, make sure you have water. And again, flying pieces can cause serious injury to the eyes. And depending where you're working, if you're up on scaffolding, a piece could drop down and hit someone also. Repointing the wall. So for us, I already told some of you guys, for us we use a plugging chisel. It looks something like that. Take this, drive that in, and it'll clean the joint out. This is just an added extra. We won't be using anything like this in the lab. We don't lay any walls that are that high. But sometimes if you're out on a job, you'll see that they have this bracing. So believe it or not, if this bracing wasn't up here, you could have a decent wind and it would blow over this entire section. When you are working with it, again, not necessarily in a lab, but you should protect your work from the elements. So usually for us, if it gets under 40 degrees, that's the cutoff for laying it, unless there's heat provided. When the temperatures are expected to be 40 or below, use curing blankets. And if it's going to rain out, we usually cover it with a plastic, and we just call that poly, or a tarp. And that protects it from direct rain. Because again, if your joints aren't set, more water added to your mortar makes it weaker. Insulated concrete block, that we don't need to worry about that. And that's it for this unit. If you have any questions, please let me know.